George Brennan stood alone in the pre-dawn darkness of his barn, lamplight flickering across 3 more dying cattle. Their labored breathing filled the cold air. Clouded eyes stared at nothing. He pulled the ledger from his coat pocket, felt its weight. Numbers inside told a story he couldn't bear to read. Debts to the bank, bills to the feed store, mortgage payment due in March. He slid it back into his pocket, unopened. 42 years old, and his father's ranch was dying under his watch. The barn smelled of sickness and failure. George moved between the animals, counting losses the way other men counted blessings. 3 more overnight made 14 total. At this rate, he'd lose the entire herd by spring. His father's voice echoed from memory. "Promise me you'll protect this place, son. For your children. For their children." George had made that promise at his father's deathbed 5 years ago. Now he was breaking it, one dead cow at a time. He'd tried everything he knew. Changed the feed, moved the herd to different pasture, brought in the farrier to check hooves. Nothing worked. The cattle kept dying, and George kept failing. The oldest heifer lay in the corner, barely moving. George knelt beside her, placed his hand on her neck. Her hide felt hot beneath his palm. Fever again, same as all the others before they died. He didn't know what was killing them, didn't know how to stop it. A man was supposed to protect what was his. That's what his father had taught him. But George couldn't protect his animals from something he couldn't understand. The weight of that failure pressed down on him like a physical thing. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. His mail-order bride would arrive on the afternoon stage. A practical woman from St. Louis who could cook and clean, manage a household, while he focused on saving the ranch. He'd written to the agency explaining his needs clearly. No romance, just help. A partner. He needed someone to take over the house so he could spend every waking hour trying to save his cattle. That seemed like his only chance now. George stood, brushed straw from his knees. The ledger shifted in his pocket, a constant reminder of debts mounting faster than he could pay them. If he lost many more cattle, the bank would take everything. His father's legacy would end with George's failure. Outside, snow began to fall. He could hear it whisper against the barn roof. Christmas should mean hope, celebration, new beginnings. For George, it meant only the weight of promises he couldn't keep. He walked to the barn door, looked out at his land disappearing under fresh snow. Fence posts leaned at angles, needing repair he couldn't afford. The house sat dark and cold. No smoke from the chimney, no warmth anywhere. Tomorrow she would arrive. A stranger who'd agreed to marry him sight unseen. He tried to picture her, but couldn't. It didn't matter what she looked like. Only that she could help him hold things together long enough to figure out what was killing his herd. George whispered to the darkness. "I asked for help. God better be listening." He pulled his coat tight against the cold, extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow, everything would change. A wife, help, maybe a chance to save what remained. He just had to survive until then. The stagecoach arrived Christmas Eve afternoon, under gray skies heavy with unspent snow. George stood beside the road, hat in hand, watching the horses labor through drifts. His stomach churned with nervousness and something close to dread. The coach door opened. A woman stepped down. George's mouth went dry. This wasn't what he'd expected. She wore a traveling suit of dark wool, practical but well made, no ribbons or lace. Her hair was pulled back, severe and simple. But what stopped George cold was what she carried. A worn leather medical bag in one hand, and behind her, a trunk marked with stamps and labels he could just make out. University of Pennsylvania. Vetter Medicine. "Mr. Brennan?" She extended her free hand. "I'm Dr. Mary Thatcher. Your bride, as contracted." George stared at her offered hand. "Doctor?" "Veterinary medicine." She shook his hand firmly when he didn't respond, then released it. 5 years practice in St. Louis before I came west. The agency provided your requirements, household management, cooking, ranch partnership. I can fulfill those obligations. I asked for a wife, George said slowly. Someone to cook and clean while I work the ranch. Mary's expression didn't change. I can cook adequately, Mr. Brennan. I can manage a household, but my real value is in that barn behind you. She tilted her head slightly. I smell sickness. Bovine, if I'm not mistaken. How many have you lost? George felt heat rise in his face. This was wrong, all wrong. He'd specified his needs clearly to the agency. A practical woman for practical work. Not some, what was she even, a woman doctor for animals? I need a wife, he repeated. Not a, you need what you need, not what you expected. Mary's voice stayed calm, almost kind. Show me your cattle, Mr. Brennan. Then we can discuss household arrangements. The driver was already unloading her trunk. Tom Hadley's wagon rolled past on the road, Tom staring openly at the scene. George felt judgment in that stare. The whole town would know by supper that George Brennan's mail-order bride was some kind of animal doctor. But Mary was already walking toward the barn. She moved with purpose, medical bag swinging at her side. George had to choose, send her back on the next stage and look like a fool, or let her examine his dying cattle and look like something worse. He followed her to the barn. Inside, Mary set down her bag and surveyed the animals with a practiced eye. She moved between them, studying their eyes, checking their breathing, running her hands over their hides. George watched, confusion warring with a desperate hope he didn't want to name. How long have they been sick? Mary knelt beside the oldest heifer. 3 weeks, losing 2 or 3 every week. Mary pulled back the cow's eyelid, examined the tissue underneath. She ran her hands down its legs, pressed carefully along its flanks. The cow barely responded. Blackleg disease. Mary stood, brushed her hands clean. Bacterial infection. Fatal if untreated, but I can save most of them. The ones not too far gone. George's heart hammered. You can save them? If you'll let me. She met his eyes directly. I'll need supplies from town. Serum, disinfectant, clean needles. And Mr. Brennan? She paused. I'll need you to stop thinking of me as your mail-order bride and start thinking of me as your partner. Can you do that? George looked at his dying cattle, looked at this strange woman with her medical bag and her steady confidence. Everything he'd been taught said women didn't do this kind of work, but everything he'd tried on his own had failed. Mary waited, patient, not begging, not demanding, just offering. Do what you can, George said finally. Mary rolled up her sleeves. I'll need those supplies before dark. Make a list. As Mary examined each animal, George watched and remembered. His father had built this ranch from nothing, turned raw land into something that could support a family. Jacob Brennan had possessed an instinct for cattle, a sense for weather, a kind of knowing that George had never inherited. Your father teach you ranching? Mary asked, not looking up from the cow she was examining. Tried to. George leaned against the barn wall. He had a gift for it. Knew what cattle needed before they knew themselves. I never got that sense. Mary glanced at him. Medicine can be learned. Instinct helps, but knowledge matters more. George thought about the 2 hard winters that had weakened his herd. The predatory loan he'd taken when feed prices spiked. The bad stock he'd bought from a trader passing through. Half the animals already sick with something he couldn't identify. One bad decision after another, and now he stood on the edge of losing everything. His father would have seen through that trader, would have known better than to take that bank loan. Would have recognized blackleg disease the first day symptoms appeared. George had recognized nothing except his own failure. Blackleg is bacterial, Mary said, moving to the next animal. Enters through wounds in the skin, usually. Multiplies in muscle tissue, produces gas and toxins. The swelling you see, the fever, the lameness, all symptoms of bacterial colonization. She spoke like she was teaching, not showing off. George listened despite himself. Treatment requires antitoxin serum injected directly into healthy tissue. We'll isolate the sick animals, disinfect the barn, dispose of contaminated bedding. The ones too far gone, she paused. We'll make them comfortable. But the others, most of them, I can save. George heard certainty in her voice. Not arrogance, just professional confidence. He'd asked for help, and help had arrived, just not in the form he'd imagined. Why did you come west? The question emerged before he could stop it. Mary finished her examination, wiped her hands on a cloth from her bag. In St. Louis, I had a practice. Small, but growing. Then I treated animals owned by women, ladies who bred dogs, kept riding horses. The men who controlled the Veterinary Association didn't approve. They made it clear I wasn't welcome. Her voice stayed level, factual. I needed a place where my skills mattered more than my gender. Your advertisement offered marriage and partnership on a ranch. I saw an opportunity. I asked for a wife who could cook. I can cook, Mr. Brennan. I just happen to also save dying cattle. Mary picked up her medical bag. Now we can spend time debating whether I'm what you wanted, or we can save your herd. Your choice. George pushed off the wall. His pride wanted to argue, to send her back, to maintain some sense of how things should be. But his dying cattle made that pride a luxury he couldn't afford. What supplies do you need? Mary pulled a small notebook from her bag, wrote quickly. This list. The pharmacy in town should have most of it. If not, they can order from Cheyenne. She tore out the page, handed it to him. Their fingers touched briefly. Mary's hands were clean despite her work, practical and steady. Not soft like the hands of women he knew in town, but not rough either. Doctor's hands. After you return, I'll start treatments. Mary looked around the barn. We'll work through the night if necessary. Time matters with Blackleg. George took the list, scanned items he didn't understand. Antitoxin serum, carbolic acid, sterilization equipment. The cost would be significant, but the cost of losing more cattle would be worse. One more thing, Mr. Brennan. Mary's voice stopped him at the barn door. Stop thinking of me as your mail-order bride and start thinking of me as your partner. Can you do that? George didn't answer, couldn't answer. Everything he knew about the world, about men's work and women's place, about proper order and natural roles, all of it collided with the simple fact that this woman might be the only thing standing between him and complete ruin. He walked out into the cold afternoon. Behind him, Mary lit a second lamp, placed it beside his on the workbench. 2 lights instead of 1. By the time George returned from town, snow was falling heavy and thick. Christmas Eve had arrived, and nothing was as he'd expected. But his cattle were still breathing, and Dr. Mary Thatcher was still there. That would have to be enough. Christmas Day passed without celebration. While other families gathered for feast and prayer, George and Mary worked in the cold barn. Mary taught him to identify symptoms he'd missed. The slight swelling in the shoulder that meant infection was spreading. The particular sound of labored breathing that indicated toxins in the bloodstream. The way a cow's stance shifted when pain became unbearable. You see this darkening here? Mary pointed to discoloration on the heifer's flank. That's gas building under the skin. Classic Blackleg presentation. George leaned closer, studying what she showed him. He'd looked at these animals every day for 3 weeks and never seen what Mary identified in minutes. The knowledge made him feel foolish and grateful in equal measure. Mary's hands moved with surgical precision as she prepared the first injection. She drew serum into a clean needle, tapped out air bubbles, found the injection site with practiced efficiency. The cow flinched, but Mary's grip stayed firm. "Hold her steady," Mary said. George moved to the cow's head, gripped the halter. Mary injected the serum, withdrew the needle, pressed a clean cloth against the puncture. That's 20 units. We'll repeat in 12 hours if she tolerates it well. They moved to the next animal, then the next. Mary worked methodically, explaining each step. George held cattle steady, fetched supplies, learned despite himself. In St. Louis, I had a small clinic, Mary said while preparing another injection. Mostly dogs and horses at first, then word spread. Farm families started bringing animals, sick calves, injured pigs, the work I'd trained for. What changed? George asked. Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett brought her prize mare. Difficult birth, full breech. I saved both mother and baby. Mary's voice stayed neutral. Mrs. Garrett told her friends. Soon I had more female clients than male. The Veterinary Association decided that was inappropriate. George heard what she didn't say. Men had pushed her out for helping women. The frontier might be rough, but its prejudices traveled well. By midday, they'd treated 15 animals. 3 were too far gone. Mary examined them carefully, shook her head. These 3 won't survive. Best we can do is keep them comfortable. The admission hurt, but George appreciated her honesty. She didn't offer false hope. They broke for cold lunch, bread and cheese Mary prepared while George tended the fire. She moved efficiently in his kitchen, clearly uncomfortable but competent. My mother taught me basic cooking, Mary said. Not my strength, but I manage. You're doing fine. George meant it. Afternoon brought Tom Hadley's unwelcome visit. George heard the knock, opened the door to his neighbor's florid face. Merry Christmas, George. Tom peered past him toward the barn. Thought I'd check how you're settling in with your new bride. We're busy, Tom. Cattle sick. So I heard. Also heard your woman's out in the barn doing man's work. Tom's tone made the word sound ugly. Mighty strange Christmas, George. Your woman working cattle while you, what, hold her bag? Heat flushed George's face. Mary's a veterinarian. She's saving my herd. Tom's eyebrows rose. A what now? A lady animal doctor? He laughed, not kindly. Lord, George, what kind of wife did you order? The kind who knows what she's doing. George's voice came out harder than intended. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to finish. He closed the door before Tom could respond. Through the window, he watched his neighbor walk back to his wagon, shaking his head. By sundown, the whole valley would know. George Brennan's mail-order bride was in his barn doctoring cattle. Let them talk. His cattle were being saved. That evening, working by lamplight, George asked the question that had been building all day. How did you know where to inject? What made you suspect blackleg? Mary looked up from her notes. Training, study, practice, same as any skill. Could you teach me? Something shifted in Mary's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Yes, Mr. Brennan, I could teach you. They worked until midnight. 7 cattle showed improvement. The 3 dying ones remained comfortable. 8 more needed treatment in the morning. George walked Mary to the house, carried her medical bag. Inside, the fire had burned low. Mary studied the spare bedroom, nodded acceptance. Thank you for today, George said awkwardly. We're partners now. Mary met his eyes. Whether you intended it or not. After she closed her door, George sat at the kitchen table, exhausted. Through the window, he could see the barn, lamplight still glowing where they'd been working. 2 lights instead of 1. Maybe that was enough. New Year's week arrived with bitter cold and cautious hope. 3 cattle had died despite Mary's treatments, but 7 were recovering. George watched the survivors grow stronger each day, their eyes clearing, their breathing easing. Mary's success rate was undeniable. Even George's stubborn pride couldn't argue with cattle that stood and ate when they should have been dead. He found himself asking questions constantly now, not to challenge her, but to learn. Why do you inject there instead of the shoulder? What makes you think this one needs a second dose? How long before we can move them back to the main herd? Mary answered each question patiently. treating him like a student rather than a skeptic. "You're a quick study, Mr. Brennan," she said one morning while they worked together. "George. You can call me George." She smiled slightly. "George, then. And you should call me Mary." It felt like crossing some invisible threshold. Partners used first names. The barrier between them was eroding like snow in spring sun. George noticed small things, how Mary's hands never trembled during delicate work, how she hummed softly when concentrating, how her face softened when a sick animal showed improvement. One evening, sitting by the fire after another long day, Mary spoke suddenly. "I answered your advertisement because I needed a place where my skills mattered more than my gender. You offered marriage and partnership on a ranch. I saw an opportunity to practice medicine where results would speak louder than prejudice." George stared into the flames. "I asked for a wife to cook my meals because I was ashamed to admit I was failing, ashamed to ask for real help." The admission cost him, but Mary only nodded. Shame's a poor foundation for anything. Better to build on honesty. She opened his ledger, the one George had kept closed for weeks. Her finger traced down columns of numbers, debts mounting faster than income. She didn't judge, just studied the figures like symptoms requiring diagnosis. "Your cattle are your capital," Mary said finally. "We save them, we save everything. But that's not enough. We need additional income." "From where?" George couldn't keep bitterness from his voice. "I could offer veterinary services to other ranchers, contract work, established fees. You know these people, this land. I know medicine. Together we'd be offering something no one else can." George's first instinct was refusal. The idea of Mary working for neighbors, of him, what? Following her around like some kind of assistant? Tom Hadley would laugh him off every ranch in the valley. But the ledger's numbers didn't care about his pride. "They'd mock us," George said. "A woman veterinarian? They'd never accept it." "They will if their animals are dying and I can save them." Mary's voice stayed calm. "Pride doesn't pay mortgages, George. Knowledge does." She was right. George hated that she was right, but couldn't argue with simple truth. "Let me think about it," he said finally. Mary closed the ledger gently. "Of course, but think quickly. We're running out of time." That night, George lay awake in his cold bedroom. Through the wall, he could hear Mary's quiet movements as she prepared for sleep. A stranger who'd become essential in less than 2 weeks. She'd saved his cattle. Maybe she could save his ranch too, if he was brave enough to let her try. Morning brought the question he'd been avoiding. How would we even start? Offering your services? Mary looked up from treating a healing cow. "Cattlemen's Association has a meeting in February. You could introduce me. Let me explain what I offer." They'd laugh me out of the room. Maybe. Or maybe one man has a sick animal and needs help more than he needs to mock you. Mary finished her injection, turned to face him. "You're stronger than you think, George. You've already accepted help in a form you never expected. That takes courage." George wasn't sure about courage. Mostly he felt confused, off balance, like the world had tilted, and he was still learning to walk on the new angle. But his cattle were healing. That much was real. "I'll think about it," he repeated. Mary smiled, and this time it was full and genuine. "That's all I ask." Outside, January wind howled against the barn. Still deep winter, but something was shifting. George could feel it. Mid-January brought fresh misery. 2 more cattle fell sick, not with blackleg, but with pneumonia from harsh weather. Mary treated them with different medicines, explained the distinction between bacterial and respiratory infections. Both animals responded to treatment, but the community's whispers grew louder than any medicine could cure. George noticed it first, in town. Women who'd always greeted him turned away. Men he'd known for years, studied their boots when he passed. The general store owner's wife made pointed comments about proper wifely duties, while Mary stood 3 feet away examining harness buckles. Sunday's sermon made it worse. Pastor Jameson spoke on divine order, men's roles, women's place. Never mentioned names, but everyone knew. The whole congregation stared at George and Mary sitting stiff in their pew. After church, Tom Hadley cornered George by the wagons. "When's your wife going to start being a wife?" "George, my Sarah says she hasn't seen Mary at a single ladies' meeting. Too busy playing doctor to do proper woman's work?" George's jaw clenched. "Mary's saving my cattle. That's more important than quilting circles." "That's what you think? That your wife, working like a man, is something to defend?" Tom shook his head. "You're making yourself a laughing stock, making all of us uncomfortable. Tell her to stay in the house where she belongs." George wanted to defend Mary, wanted to explain, but the words tangled in his throat, and Tom walked away before George found them. He drove home in silence. Mary sat beside him, face carefully blank. She'd heard every word. "I'm sorry," George said finally. "Don't be. I expected this." Mary's voice stayed level, but George heard the hurt underneath. "I've faced worse." That evening, after chores, Mary set down her medical bag with unusual care. "George, I've been thinking. This arrangement isn't fair to you. The community's judgment, the gossip. I could leave, annul the marriage. You could find someone more suitable." The words hit George like a physical blow. "Leave?" "Write to the agency. Explain I wasn't what you needed. They'd refund your fee, arrange another match. Someone who'd cook your meals and attend church socials without causing scandal." George stared at her. The idea of Mary leaving, of going back to managing alone, of losing not just her veterinary skills, but her steady presence, her quiet competence, her— "No," he said. "George, you're not going anywhere." The words came out fierce. "I don't care what Tom Hadley thinks, or the pastor, or the women at church, or anyone else in this valley." Mary searched his face. "Even if it cost you their respect?" "I lost my own respect letting this ranch die. You gave it back." George moved closer. "That's worth more than Tom Hadley's good opinion. More than all their opinions combined." Something shifted in Mary's expression, not quite relief, but close. "You mean that?" "I do." George realized he meant it completely. Somewhere between Christmas Eve and now, between watching her save dying cattle and teaching him what he didn't know, Mary had become essential. Not just useful, essential. "All right, then," Mary's voice softened. "Partners?" "Partners," George confirmed. They went to bed with the question settled. But George lay awake, listening to January wind and thinking about the cost of partnership. Not just to his reputation, but to something deeper. The world he'd always known was cracking apart, making room for something new. He wasn't sure he was ready. But ready or not, change had arrived, with a worn leather medical bag and a woman who wouldn't diminish herself for anyone's. Comfort. George decided that was worth defending. The bank's letter arrived on a bitter January morning. George opened it with shaking hands, read words he'd been dreading for months. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. Payment required by March 15th, or the bank would seize the property. Final notice. He sat at the kitchen table, the letters spread before him like a death sentence. Even with Mary's treatments, even with most of the herd recovering, he wouldn't have enough cattle ready for spring sale. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. George opened the ledger, made calculations he'd been avoiding. The numbers confirmed his fear. Short by nearly $300, and no way to make up the difference in 6 weeks. His father's ranch, his family's legacy, would die with him. Mary found him there an hour later, head in his hands, The ledger opened to its damning figures. She read the bank letter in silence, then studied the ledger carefully. "We're short," George said unnecessarily. "Even selling every healthy head, we won't make the payment." Mary sat beside him. She didn't speak, didn't offer empty comfort. Just placed her hand over his on the table, sharing the weight. They sat like that for long minutes, winter light fading outside the window. "There might be a way," Mary said finally. George looked at her. "What way?" "The Cattlemen's Association meeting, February 10th. Every rancher in the valley attends." Mary spoke carefully, thinking as she talked. "We go together. You introduce me, explain what I do. We offer combined services, my veterinary expertise, your land management knowledge. Contract work, established fees." They'd laugh us out of the room. Maybe. Or maybe one man has sick animals and needs help more than he needs to preserve his pride. Mary squeezed his hand. "It's a chance, George. Maybe the only one we have." George thought about his father's voice, the promises he'd made. "Pride's a poor crop, son. Won't feed you through winter." His father had said that once, watching a neighbor's ranch fail from stubbornness. "I'd be introducing my wife as a business partner, asking her to work like an equal," Mary interrupted gently. "Like someone whose skills matter as much as yours." Is that so terrible? When she put it that way, it didn't sound terrible at all. It sounded like the truth George had been learning all month. Mary's knowledge had value. Her training had worth. Why shouldn't they offer it to others? "What if we fail?" George asked. "Then we fail together." "But George?" Mary waited until he met her eyes. "We're already succeeding together. Your cattle are healing. We're learning from each other. That's partnership. Why not take it further?" George looked around his father's kitchen, saw the ranch through the window, the land he'd almost lost. Saw Mary beside him, steady and sure. "Equal partners?" he asked. "Equal partners," Mary confirmed. George extended his hand. They shook on it, sealing not just a business arrangement, but something deeper. A choice to build something new from the wreckage of old expectations. "We'll go to the meeting," George said. "Together." Mary smiled, and George saw hope in that smile. Together. Outside, the first hint of thaw dripped from the barn eaves. Still winter, still cold, but spring was possible now. George could feel it in the subtle shift of the world, in Mary's hand still holding his, in the decision they'd just made. They spent the evening planning. Mary wrote out a clear explanation of her services, her training, her success rate. George listed ranchers most likely to need help, ones whose herds he'd noticed struggling. "Tom Hadley lost 5 head last month," George said. "Wouldn't say why, but I saw symptoms. Could be blackleg." "We offer him help first then," Mary said, publicly. "Let him refuse if he wants, but make the offer genuine." They worked until late, 2 lamps burning on the table, plans taking shape. The dark night was passing. Dawn approached, and with it, the decision to fight for what they'd built together. George went to bed that night feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but close. Theration, a sense of possibility. Mary was right. They were stronger together than apart. Now they just had to make everyone else see it. The Cattlemen's Association met in the back room of Sullivan's Saloon. 15 ranchers crowded around tables pushed together. George walked in with Mary beside him, and the room fell silent. Tom Hadley smirked. Walt Garrison frowned. The younger ranchers stared openly at Mary in her practical traveling suit, medical bag in hand. George felt every eye on them, felt judgment thick as smoke. His throat went dry. Pastor Jameson cleared his throat. "George, this is association business. Perhaps your wife should wait." "She's here on business," George interrupted. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "I have something to say. All of you need to hear it." He moved to the front of the room, Mary beside him. His heart hammered, but his feet stayed steady. "3 months ago, I was losing my herd to disease," George began. "I didn't know what I was fighting. Tried everything I knew. Nothing worked. I was failing, and I was too proud to admit it." The room stayed silent. George forced himself to continue. "This is Dr. Mary Thatcher. She's a veterinarian, trained at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also my wife. When she arrived Christmas Eve, I expected someone to cook my meals. Instead, I got someone who saved my cattle." Tom Hadley opened his mouth. George raised his hand. "Before you judge, know this. Mary diagnosed blackleg disease in 10 minutes, treated 23 head of cattle, saved all but 3. That's 23 reasons I'm still ranching instead of begging for work at someone else's spread." George looked around the room, met skeptical eyes directly. "You can mock a woman doing what you call men's work. Or you can ask yourselves how many cattle you've lost because you didn't know what was killing them. Pride doesn't pay mortgages, gentlemen. Knowledge does. Mary has knowledge. I'm offering it. We're offering it to anyone smart enough to accept help, no matter where it comes from." The silence stretched. George felt sweat on his back despite the cold room. Old Walt Garrison spoke first. "Lost 5 head last month, George. Don't know why. They just sickened and died." He looked at Mary. "You think you could help, ma'am? I'd be obliged to hear what you have to say." Mary stepped forward. "I'd be happy to examine your herd, Mr. Garrison. No charge for the initial consultation. If I can identify the problem, we can discuss treatment." Walt nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Another rancher, young Peterson from the North Valley, raised his hand. "I've got a mare that's been off her feed for 2 weeks. Vet from Cheyenne said nothing could be done. Would you look at her?" "Of course," Mary said. One by one, ranchers approached. Not all of them. Tom Hadley stayed seated, face dark. But enough. Enough to matter. They discussed fees, schedules, Mary's availability. George added his knowledge of local herds, grazing patterns, seasonal challenges. Together, they painted a picture of comprehensive service no one else offered. By meeting's end, Mary had 5 contracted consultations, 5 chances to prove her worth. As they prepared to leave, Tom Hadley stood. "George, wait!" George turned, wary. Tom's face had lost its smirk. "I was wrong," Tom said quietly. "About her, about you, about all of it." He extended his hand. "If my herd takes sick, I'll be calling on you both." George shook his neighbor's hand, felt years of friendship restored in that grip. Outside, February sunlight broke through clouds. Still cold, but brighter than it had been. Mary took George's arm as they walked to their wagon. "That took courage," she said. "No. Courage was watching you work and learning to see past what I was taught. Today was just honesty." George helped her into the wagon. "Easiest thing I ever did." They drove home in comfortable silence. George thought about the contracts they'd secured, the income they'd generate, the mortgage payment now within reach. But more than that, he thought about standing before his neighbors and claiming Mary as his equal partner, about defending what they'd built together, about choosing truth over comfort. His father would have been proud. George was proud of himself. That was something new. Late April arrived with warmth and green grass and the sound of birds returning. George stood in the barn doorway at dawn, watching healthy cattle graze spring pasture. Behind him, 2 lamps sat side by side on the workbench. Mary's tools, his tools, sharing space. The ranch had transformed. 42 head of cattle now, healthy and multiplying. The ledger showed black ink for the first time in 2 years. Mary's contracted work with neighboring ranches brought steady income beyond George's expectations. More than that, the work itself had changed. George accompanied Mary on every call, combining his knowledge of local land with her medical expertise. They'd become a team that functioned with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Last week, they'd saved Walt Garrison's entire herd from pneumonia. Peterson's mare recovered completely. Even Tom Hadley had called them out for a sick bull. Mary diagnosed a simple infection, treated it successfully, and Tom paid without complaint. The community that had judged now accepted. Not universally, some women still avoided Mary at church, but enough. The general store owner's daughter asked Mary about veterinary school, eyes bright with possibility. Pastor Jameson mentioned the wisdom of recognizing gifts in his Sunday sermon. George repaired the ranch gate that morning, Mary working beside him. They moved in wordless coordination, partners in every sense. "Remember when you arrived?" George asked, holding a post steady. Mary hammered nails with practiced precision. "I remember you looked like I'd brought plague instead of help." George laughed, surprising himself. Laughter came easier now. "I expected someone to cook my meals. God sent me a partner who saved my life." "I expected security," Mary said. "I found a man willing to grow." She finished the last nail, tested the gate's strength. "Fair trade, I'd say." That evening, they sat on the porch, reviewing the ledger together. Not just financially solvent now, but prospering. Another rancher had contacted them about year-round veterinary services. George was considering it. "What do you think?" he asked Mary. "I think we can handle it. Together." She closed the ledger, looked at him seriously. "You've changed, George, since Christmas." "We both have." George studied his ranch, his land, his cattle. "I thought I needed someone to cook and clean while I saved the ranch myself. Turned out I needed someone to save it with me." Mary's hand found his. "Equal partners." "Always," George confirmed. The sun set over Wyoming rangeland, painting everything gold. George thought about the man he'd been Christmas Eve, desperate, failing, too proud to ask for real help. That man seemed like a stranger now. Mary had transformed more than his ranch. She'd transformed him. Taught him that partnership meant more than shared work. It meant shared respect, shared growth, shared life. A wagon rolled up the road. Tom Hadley's wife, Sarah, climbed down carrying a pie, her face cautious but friendly. "Thought you two might enjoy this," Sarah said. "Apple, your favorite." "George." Mary stood, welcomed Sarah with genuine warmth. The three of them talked easily, barriers eroding like late snow. After Sarah left, George found Mary at the barn, doing evening check on the cattle. He joined her, working side by side in comfortable silence. "What do we tackle next?" Mary asked, finishing her inspection. George smiled. The expression felt natural now, not forced. "Whatever comes, together." They walked back to the house under emerging stars. The ranch gate stood open, no longer a fortress, but a working operation connected to community. Inside, 2 lamps would burn on the kitchen table tonight while they planned tomorrow's work. George had asked for help last Christmas. Help had arrived in unexpected form, not the wife he'd ordered, but the partner he'd needed. That unexpected gift had transformed everything. The help we need often arrives in unexpected forms. Respect others' gifts, even when they differ from expectations. True partnership values each person's contributions equally. Kills matter more than stereotypes, and wisdom recognizes talent regardless of its package. George understood that now. More than understood, he lived it. "Mary," he said at the door. "Yes?" "Thank you for saving more than my cattle." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for letting me." They went inside together, partners, equals, building something neither could have created alone. Outside, spring had come to Wyoming. Inside, something deeper had taken root: respect, partnership, and the quiet comfort of knowing you're exactly where you belong. The ranch that had been dying now thrived. The man who'd been alone now had partnership. The woman who'd been dismissed now had dignity, peace, prosperity, mutual respect. A Christmas gift that kept giving, long after the snow had melted and the world had turned green again.